In the era of Access Hollywood tapes and Russian spies, it's getting harder and harder to find scandals that leave you speechless. But give 2019 credit, at least it's trying. The richest man on the planet risking complete humiliation by refusing to give in to the demands of a Trump-friendly supermarket tabloid after the National Enquirer published embarrassing text messages and photos publicizing Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos' affair last month. Bezos launched an investigation in order to find out just how the tabloid got a hold of that material. Now, here's where it gets crazy. Fast forward to last night, Bezos, in a jaw-dropping blog post, revealed what he called extortion and blackmail on the part of AMI, the parent company of the National Enquirer. They privately demanded he make a statement that he had no knowledge or basis for suggesting that AMI's coverage of his affair was politically motivated or influenced by political forces, or they'd release 10 new embarrassing photos, including ones where he's said to be naked. Wow. 2019, you're really killing me. Instead of bowing to their demands, Bezos published the emails in an attempt to expose AMI's dirty practices. In response, AMI said it would investigate, adding that it acted lawfully in the reporting of the story of Mr. Bezos. And at the time of the recent allegations made by Mr. Bezos, it was in good faith negotiations to resolve all matters with him. Complicating matters further, though, is this revelation from a Washington Post reporter having to do with Bezos' investigator.
Gavin DeBecker told us that he does not believe that Jeff Bezos' phone was hacked. He thinks it's possible that a government entity might have gotten hold of his text messages.
Which government entity? We don't know the answer to that question, but after Bezos detailed AMI's relationship with Saudi Arabia in his blog post last night, former CIA Director John Brennan theorized, quote, "I have no doubt that given the Washington Post's relentless and appropriate condemnation of Mohammed bin Salman for the killing of Khashoggi, MBS would try to discredit, embarrass, and hurt Bezos financially if he could." Wow, what a mess. Joining us at the conversation, the perfect person to untangle this dirty web, Jason Johnson, politics editor for The Root. Have at it.
Gosh, this is some House of Cards level stuff here that you've got going on. I think first and foremost,
people have got too much time.
Too much time. Look, if there's anybody who I would believe, and generally I'm going to be skeptical of some super duper oligarch like Jeff Bezos, but if there's anybody who would know the technology behind how his phone could be hacked into, it would be him. This guy knows technology. He has access to the people who could do these kinds of resources. I don't think that that was just a flimsy claim that he made. He really does believe, look, no one's going to be able to get into my phone. This must be a government level agency. But it also speaks to this. We have talked.
And he hired investigators.
And he hired investigators. But it also speaks to what we've been talking about with this administration as a whole. Whether it's President Trump, whether it's Saudi Arabia, or whether it's his relationships with these sort of dictators or non-democratic countries, his hostility or his tacit consent for attacks on the free press in America are dangerous. And going after Jeff Bezos because he happens to own a newspaper that's doing real investigation is really the scary part about this, not whether or not a bunch of pics ending up on, TMZ or the Enquirer.
Frank, can you jump in? I mean, I think one of the problems that AMI faces is that it's all just so plausible. It's so plausible to anyone with the television or that is even a casual observer of the news that the president's closest media ally tried to blackmail and extort the owner of the president's, in the president's mind, biggest media nemesis.
Yeah, it's very easy to believe, and unfortunately that's the state of affairs today. Lots of unknowns here that are very intriguing, Nicole. So you just described the statutory elements of extortion on a federal statute. So is the FBI getting called in? Has Bezos filed a complaint? Is the FBI going to look at AMI now as a subject? Do we need to go back and look at the cooperation agreement that David Pecker at AMI signed off on? Was it transactional immunity? Was it we're giving you blanket immunity as part of a cooperation agreement? This is a new crime that's being exposed, and my thought is that this will likely be prosecuted, and I think AMI's in deep trouble. Now, layer on top of this international intrigue of Bezos possibly having his phone hacked into. Very plausible. In my career in corporate security, in my career in the FBI, I can tell you that someone like Bezos is a target, and wherever his devices go, they are being hacked into. So is it possible that some foreign power got a hold of his extramarital affair-related texts and or emails or calls and provided them to AMI? And let's layer another question, since we're engaging in possible conjecture. Did the White House know anything about AMI extorting Bezos? Did any of this come up in conversation? This adds another criminal element and continues our organized crime theme of the day, which is that we're essentially dealing with a racketeering enterprise.
Let me put up the president's tweet on these topics because it's germane to the conversation we're having. I think the president just last month tweeted, "So sorry to hear the news about Jeff Bezos being taken down by a competitor who's reporting it." The idea that the Inquirer is a competitor to the Washington Post, we'll save for another show, but another unwelcome window into Trump's mind. It's far more accurate than the reporting in his lobbyist newspaper, the Amazon Washington Post. Hopefully the paper will soon be placed in better and more responsible hands. I mean, their obsession with the Washington Post is an open secret. They are obsessed with what they view as unfair, even more so than in the New York Times, which he calls the failing New York Times. He's constantly sucking up to that paper's publisher, like, "Oh, I want a nice story about being home."
Yeah,
They're obsessed with the Washington Post, and the idea that he directed a hush money scheme and he had Michael Cohen and AMI involved in that. The idea that he would direct some sort of smear campaign with the same characters, beyond plausible.
Or he doesn't, I mean, does he even need to direct it? I mean, so many times we've seen the president put out that tweet, and the people who support the president and want to act on his behalf can pick up the signals. It's not even that hard to decipher. I find, like, the layers of this story so crazy. First of all, that they would put in writing the things that they put in writing.
Yes.
And, you know, I know Chuck Rosenberg has said to me before, you know, criminals aren't necessarily smart, and so they put things like this in writing. But the things that they wrote, and then you have Bezos, who decides to kind of flip the script and shine a light on this behavior, which is fascinating. And, you know, there's a whole other element to it in terms of, like, who else have they done this to? And Bezos is in a position where he can stand up to this sort of behavior. So there's that kind of cultural aspect to it. And then there's the question of the AMI agreement. You know, their agreement says they can't commit crimes for 3 years.
Yeah.
And so now they're reviewing the agreement.
Tough. 3 years is a lot. Sometimes
they're up to a really good start.
Yeah. They like to be great at but explain that. So as part of AMI is in a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors to help them unearth and prosecute the hush money conspiracy, and they're not supposed to commit any more crimes. Right.
They're given essentially a pass and immunity in this first instance, and the terms of that agreement say that they can't commit criminal wrongdoing within a certain amount of time. And so, you know, if they were to be violated, this totally puts that agreement at risk. And
never have I seen so many people have such a hard time not committing crimes for 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
I want to jump in here because the Daily Beast has done a lot of reporting on this, some of the stuff well before Bezos came out with his own post. I would pump the brakes a tiny bit on the idea that a government entity hacked. From our own reporting, it's not pretty clear. But there is a weird, unsavory group of characters that I think is worth noting. Here's the nexus. Bezos' now girlfriend, her brother is a man named Michael Sanchez. He is being looked at as part of the Bezos' team internal investigation. Michael Sanchez has connections to a variety of weird Trump world figures. Among them is Roger Stone. We reached out to Roger Stone for our piece in reporting it. He denied hacking Bezos' phone, but what was weird about his denial is we never asked him if he hacked Bezos' phone. He just came out and said, I didn't hack the phone. That was a particularly bizarre quote.
And this is a story you're running
No,
today?
this is a story we already ran. Today we are looking into what is, I think, a well-known history of AMI, of using things like extortion and blackmail to get these types of stories. It is crazy that we finally are getting a clear view of it, thanks to Jeff Bezos actually posting about it. But he is not the only victim of this.
I want to hear more about this. We have to see. What's interesting to me is Mike Flynn, target for blackmail, Jeff Bezos not. Maybe you should hire the best people, Mr. President.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.